Good morning, Deepak. I'm joined this morning by Deepak Bagla. He's the Managing Director and CEO of Invest India, based in New Delhi. And Deepak, it is a great honor to have you with us today and jointly to shine a spotlight on what we perceive as the most vibrant ecosystem in India. So a very good morning or good afternoon to you.
Thank you. Thank you for doing this. And as I was saying, it must be fairly early for in the morning for you. And you're sitting down there in a very fancy jacket, and I can see that. As we were entire work from home, initially it was much easier and much preferable, but now it is bearing down on many of us. But let me just start. Let me give you a quick perspective on where we are. We are today on day 109 of the most unprecedented lockdown in human history. Nowhere ever before in history did you have a lockdown which involved such a large span of humanity and across the diversity of India in every which way, the diversity economically, socially, geographically, and one of the biggest challenges ever. The position today is, just to put it in perspective, is that India is divided into 729 administrative districts. These are small parts for administration person. 449 of these districts have less than 50 cases. 449. In fact, 45 have 0 cases. I have only 26 districts in India which are above 1,000 cases. And why I'm telling you this is because our government took a very strong approach on going in for a very early lockdown. The idea of focus was on saving lives. As our Prime Minister said, that if you have life, you will always have something else after that. You will always have the economy coming in. But that was where the prime focus was. And as I see it today, though we never know how this virus is playing out, it's interesting to see that we've been able to contain it within geographic areas. And the important thing of that is that at some point of time, we will obviously be able to get an upper hand on this virus. We were just discussing about the vaccine coming in, whenever that happens. That's 6 months or 12 months away. And the point then remains is how fast do economies come back into a resurgence? Is it a V, is it a U, or is it a bathtub U, whatever there is. But before I come back to the point of how we will all come out of this, a little experience of what has happened during these 109 days, the most unprecedented 109 days. One is if you go onto our website, you will have a daily immunity report, business immunity report, and that's where you will see how this pandemic changed course over time. You know, every day I would get different kinds of queries which were coming in. We were helping business primarily during this entire period with all the challenges they were facing. But at the same point of time, anybody else, the social world also, whatever they were coming through. So there were issues about the lockdown, there were issues about getting passes and movement, etc. So it's a very interesting see which you develop. 2 interesting things I must point out to you. First is, on 30th March, and we went into a lockdown in the 3rd week of March, we had 0 PPEs being manufactured in India, 0. On the 15th of June, we had a run rate of 750,000 PPEs a day. The most amazing learning from this, that how the MSME business of India could pivot its business models, be nimble, and change everything and come back with a world-class PPE, which, by the way, also includes ventilators. I mean, very highly sophisticated instruments like ventilators, etc. And that was really something which was extremely laudable. It came across how well and nimble and innovative Indian business could be. The second part to that is that even during this entire period, when we look at the pharmaceutical support to the entire world, especially with all the tablets which had to go out, India was the one which supplied those to 123 countries across the globe. Mm-hmm. India got firmly established that even in the most difficult of times, we were there to supply the world with what they were looking for, the HCQ tablets. And more importantly, you know that about 70% of the financial transactions you do yourself or across the Atlantic are processed out of India. And even during this entire challenge, one of the things our team did very well was to completely insulate that entire processing part so the world remained unaffected, and especially your entire financial transactions when you were doing that, so that we continued supporting on our commitments wherever we made them in the world. There are two other interesting things which come out of it. We were just having a discussion of what COVID has done to all of us, this little virus. And one is, it has typically amplified and catalyzed some of the existing underlying trends which were there in the world already. And I'll give you an example. De-risking has always been a core philosophy of business ever since we've all got into it. But over time, I think people tend to forget it to a large extent. And you saw business moving to where it could be made cheaper, or products moving into operations where it could be cheaper, not necessarily smarter. What this has amplified in everyone's face is that that core element of de-risking remains a core element of business. And so what am I seeing now? And I've seen a large number of business interests coming in from across the globe, especially so from 17 countries and across sectors, seeing how they can onshore their business or reshore their business to where the market is. And that's where you will see a reshoring of supply chains to a large extent. You don't want to be in a situation where you're very far away from where the market is and you're sitting on large heaps of inventory, losing out money, not being able to transport it.
Deepak, we have heard that a lot, not this integration, but the de-risking of overstretched global supply chains and the use of modern technologies, AMR, advanced manufacturing, robotics, in order to be able to reshore even in higher cost locations. So that actually may play out as a very good future opportunity for our tech communities if this becomes a more sustained trend indeed.
Absolutely. And you know, the interesting thing there is that how you defined efficiency in the pre-COVID world was only about financial costs being brought down. But I think the post-COVID world will see efficiency as a definition in a different manner, where it is smarter. It is not only about making it financially or cost-effective a little cheaper, but it is how fast you can get to the marketplace, how close you can be to the marketplace. And the other element which I see out of that is long supply chains becoming shorter. Now, what do I mean by that? I see clusters of businesses adopting themselves. So what happens within that cluster, you will have the supply chain more closely knit, rather than supply chains depending on clusters in different parts of the world or different parts of the geography and being interconnected. So that is another element which might be coming out of this one.
Yeah. Do you think we will see the physical supply chains to get smarter, but also closer knitted? But that's our hope as Startup Genome, at least, that we still retain this global fabric of knowledge. So instead of a global supply chain, we got a global chain of ideas, a global chain of intellectual property, as opposed to physical goods being produced in these overextended chains.
Absolutely, completely agree with you. The second element, digitization. I think the adoption of digitization, especially in countries and societies where it was a bit slower, they've realized they have to pace it up. And when I say that, do not think that I'm only referring to what were quoted as less developed countries or underdeveloped countries. I think adoption has been much slower even in some of the most developed countries and societies of the economy. What helped us immensely in containing this virus at where we are as of now. So I must, by the way, put in my little asterisk on that one, that we have no idea, anyone in the world, at least I believe, that where do we stand? Are we at the beginning, in the middle, or the end? And I think it was very well put the other day. I heard that we are in the same storm, but in different boats. So how each one of us is going to be reacting to it, I really don't know on that one. But yes, what helped us immensely is the very focused digitization effort, which the government and Prime Minister Modi had taken off in the past 6 years of being in India. So typically we came up with the India stack, where we had 1 billion people connected to a mobile phone, we had 1 billion people connected to a bank account, and we had 1 billion people with a unique identity number. Now, this is what helped us to a large extent, or is helping us currently to a large extent, in being able to see how we can try and work through challenges like the one which we are facing today. And within that sphere, what is now estimated by UNCTAD, etc., that in the next 12 to 24 months, so last year we had FDI, global FDI of about $1.3 trillion. In the next 24 months, it's going to be down by more than 50%. That means now we are getting into a world which will have one of the most fiercely fought beauty parades. And these beauty parades will now be completely focused on how each economy and society is going to beautify its own self to make itself attractive. It's not just going to be about a fiscal benefit. Because I think this is the first time in our history again where we've been hit by a demand and the supply side at the same time. The shock is coming. So there's very little monetary and fiscal policy leeway which societies and governments have today. As a result, the new beauty parade will be on how we make ourselves more efficient in bringing business, basically in seeing how can we be smarter in getting them executed in a shorter span of time, let us say. And that is where we are seeing, especially what I've seen, at least in our government here in the past 90 days, there have been some unprecedented reforms by the government, all towards announcing to making business much easier in their journey in India. Labor reforms, reforms in the ease of doing business, reforms in getting approvals in a much faster manner and in a much easier manner. Essentially making the investor the center point and the center focus of the entire effort, which is where it ought to. So governments which are smart have used this virus to be able to come up with situations and answers and resolutions to old pending problems, and using this as an opportunity to turn it around to make that happen. I think that is a very positive element coming out of this entire COVID era. I agree that we will now be into at some point of time, as I was saying, when we turn out of this as a V, a U, or a bathtub U, I don't know, and it's going to be different for each one of us. But yes, in many ways, the world is going to be significantly different. Is it that we all become extremely narcissist after we get out and try and see that the world is short-lived and just live the best of it? Or we become far more patient in our expectations of life. We've suddenly realized that staying at home is also an interesting way, and cooking by yourself and not always ordering food in or going out is also another interesting way of getting to your life. Remembering the importance of families being together. How it could also rechange the way your living room is, because then you might have to see your office space being created there. But one very critical element which I see out of this one coming out, and I see that, in my opinion, I think it will sustain over time. Working from home essentially means you can work from anywhere. That's the other form of it. And what I'm seeing there is that how we had big metropolitan growth centers, maybe you do not require that in the same proportion going forward in the pre-COVID world.
It's actually interesting, Deepak. I'm based in London, and we have seen the startup economy strive over the last 10 years. It's been an incredible success story, a completely digital world. But at the same time, we've also seen an immense property play around 1 square mile, the city of London, the financial district of London, where everybody tried to pile in and drove property prices through the roof. Startups, workspaces that provided their respective spaces, etc. So in a sense, counterintuitive. Been in a world that's entirely working digital, but still this incredibly strong desire to have community, to have physical community. And that also might or might not change. Let's see how it develops.
So there are two elements to that one as I see it. One is also democratizing opportunities. That means anybody sitting in a small town or city anywhere in the world has the same access to that opportunity opening up as anybody sitting in a metro. It's not just confined to a few set of people. That democracy is going to be very, very valuable. And that means that there's going to be a huge shift in what at one time was looked at as the bottom half of the pyramid.
Yeah, very, very positive message. I spoke with a large investor in Brazil 2 weeks ago, and she basically stated that to this point, as a startup seeking investment, Series A round, you would have to be physically in Sao Paulo. That's the place. Nothing else would count. Since COVID, we've gone virtual. You can sit in the Amazon on the Amazon River with a brilliant idea, and you stand the exactly same chances of getting the investment. That was a very upbeat message. I'm not sure if you see the same in India, but listening to you, it seems very similar. And I found that incredibly uplifting and positive message.
Absolutely. See, 70%, which is of my human resource, which is approximately 10% of the global human resource, lives in my small towns and villages. Mm-hmm. Each one of them will now have the same level of access to an opportunity. And I think, let me tell you another one which is going to help it very well, is the digitization of education. It is no longer going to remain confined to the rich and the few. When I can get that course online, universities themselves in any case will be forced to change their business models. You don't always have to pay $100,000 a year to get a degree somewhere sitting in the West because of a university. One, I see a focus changing on to some well-known professors who are known for their courses, and they will be able to reach out to a larger set of audience, which could be much cheaper and much more accessible to everyone. And the moment that education comes across and that awareness comes across to each and every person sitting in the world, and that to sitting anywhere in the world, you would have redrawn the entire map of the globe.
Yeah, so democratizing access to education, to funding opportunities. Maybe this gives us the big shift here at Genome. It always has been our mission to democratize access to startup ecosystems, break the concentration of Silicon Valley, New York, and London, and make it more accessible to many more cities. And we've seen some positive developments. This really might give it an extra uplift, obviously. So that's again a very positive and upbeat message. Deepak, when you think about access to knowledge, digital infrastructure, etc., it's one part of it. What's worrying us a little bit, and that's more a global perspective here. When we look at investor behavior, when we look at the startups, we've done some research, startup scale-ups. We found that every 4 out of 10 startups today are in what we would call a red zone globally. They got 3 months or fewer of capital, of runway. Our VC funding analysis shows us we've dropped by 20% globally in the first 3 months of 2020, January, February, March. We look at China, where the crisis hit first. It was down by 50%. It's slowly recovering now, but by no means at the levels of last year. So we are in this double bind. On the one hand side, small runway. On the other hand side, investors that are either hesitant or have no dry powder for investments left. So if you want to capitalize on these opportunities, we need to ensure that the funding part for the ecosystem, for the startups, for the SMEs also works. What's been your experience around that when you look at India? The numbers I just quoted are the global averages.
Sure. Let me just give you a little pre-COVID scenario and then take it down to what happened. So, you know, the Prime Minister Modi launched Startup India on 16 January 2016. So we are very young in that field. We're just about 4.5 years old. And you know, Invest India is the execution arm for Startup India. Let me tell you where we were this January on startups. We were number 3 in the world in number of unicorns. In fact, I added a unicorn every month last year. We are number 2 in the world in number of startups. So we have, as per industry sources, we have about 70,000 startups. We've just gone a little ahead of you, with due respect.
An enormous scale.
In terms of numbers. And we are number 1 in the world with new startups adding every day. I have over 7 startups coming in every day. Okay. What is more interesting, 2 elements of my startups, and this was pre-COVID. One is, I remember I told you we have 729 administrative districts of India. That is, these are divisions physically, on which each division has a government entity which manages that. Of those 729, I have a registered startup. That means it is registered with the government. And there are a number of startups which are not yet registered with the government. in over 530 of them. That means the engine of growth of India has moved away from the big towns and cities and is now in the smaller towns and cities of India. The second point, and this is what happened when one of the three largest PE firms, and I'm not talking of a VC firm, the founder of one of the top three largest PE firms of the world was in my office for 40 minutes, spent 4 hours. He wanted to meet a few startups. He walked out after that 4-hour meeting, putting his personal money in 3 of them. And
Amazing.
he told me, you know what I loved about your startups? And he's not India based. What I loved about your startups is that they are giving me solutions to the bottom half of the world's pyramid population. He actually said they're giving me solutions to 6 billion of the world's population and not the top 1 billion. And these are very based on frugal innovation. That is the strength of the Indian startup scenario. Now what has happened? See, the problem what this little virus has done to startup community across the globe, and ours too, on that entire momentum builder, is that for them, the problem is not of liquidity. The problem is of solvency with a lot of these startups.
Mm-hmm.
It is to see how they can go through this entire runway, which could be another 6 months or 9 months. And the ones which survive this runway in some manner. Now, the ones which are at a very early stage and they are not have a very high burnout, they are the ones which will be able to go longer. What had happened is, if you look at the pre-COVID world, we had come into a scenario, and not in India though, but in large parts of the world, where liquidity was coming in much easier to a number of these startups. The moment liquidity becomes easy, the burn rate comes out much faster.
Indeed.
Liquidity was always a challenge for my startups anyway. They, in any case, have the maximum utilization of that capital which they can get. They preserve it to as much possible as they can. You see, for us, our startups in India, the race has not been the race to speed up to be number 1. The race has been far more gradual of our startups because we have a very big domestic market for them to keep putting the building blocks very strong. So that is where I feel by and large that a large number of Indian startups will come out stronger out of this pandemic, because they would have had to just, even for the ones who were earning or who were adding on more fat on the burn, to try and get themselves trimmer. But yes, startups which were just going into an unrealistic race or a market share capture, even by burning as much fuel as they can, are the ones which are going to slow down or rethink their business models, and which are at that phase.
Do you think it is going to, I understand the point about very early stage startups and very frugal behavior, which absolutely makes sense. When I look at scale-up segments, companies that are building up from 10 to 50 people to 100 people to 500 people, seeking to establish other markets, being fully conscious of the size of the domestic economy and market in India. Do you think that there will be a significant slowdown? Because that's the point where really the typical Series A and further rounds are required, in a good sense required, not just to burn capital, but to sustain this momentum. So that's where we are at the moment, wondering how much the impact will be, and almost fearful of losing a generation of these early scaling companies.
That takes me back to that early statement that we are in the same storm but in different boats. Mm-hmm. So let's look at the boat in India. You see, what I'm referring to is startups which are completely dependent on cross-border activity for a market. Okay, so if they don't have a domestic market which is big enough and they have to get to where the market is, the challenge becomes larger because there are more challenges to that. In the Indian context, the market at home itself is so big. You see, when I told you that I've become number 3 in the world in unicorns, and I added a unicorn one every month last year, it's because the size of the domestic market is huge. And the second thing is accessing that market because of the digitization has made it much easier and cheaper. Let me give you an example. In the past 48 months, a brand new telecom company gets 100 million new customers in 180 days at 1/5 of cost of acquisition of a client or that of a global average. Think about any time.
Incredible scale, yeah.
Now that has happened because one, you have a market which is large enough. I guess in the free democratic world, you will not have a market of 1.5 billion people within the same geographic national boundary, at least for the next 100 years. And I'm going to be 1.5 billion by 2026, 27, which is the highest human capital on the planet. Now think about access to that market with digitization has made it so much simpler and easier. So these startups will be able to now take on the next levels of their journey, accessing it if they are smart. Because this is where the rule does apply, the Darwinian theory, that you will be there only if you're good and you're getting it right. So I think with them, Indian startups will have a very good run. Yes, it is a challenging period for them. A large number of them have had to relook at their businesses, but that is where the other part comes in, which I told you about the PPEs. The ability to be nimble and the ability to pivot your business models. And for that best utilization of that dollar or rupee which is with you. These are the three mantras to take on any new startup. And the thing with India is because of the limited resources, financial resources, which our startups had, they were already working within the constraints of these three.
Yeah, I find that particularly interesting. So the statement your guest private equity investor made about this is frugal innovation. It is happening in a large domestic market, and it provides access to a vast amount of the global population. Yeah, thinking about that, it's a really interesting and positive and upbeat message. Indeed.
No, and that strength of frugal innovation is what will now drive the next journey for all these startups, not just in India, but globally. Sorry, all yours.
Yeah, but we shall at Genome, we shall shine the light on that and put our research behind it, because I really want to monitor these trends and really see how they establish themselves post-crisis. So once we come out, what kind of trends, different supply chains, the rise of AMR in order to concentrate or reshore production, these frugal innovation, these will be very interesting trends to watch. Other digital solutions like education changing, and the role of digital and bringing education home to every point in the world. That's something we're really keen on monitoring going forward, and seeing if it is sustainable post-crisis, or if people are going to fall back into old patterns. Let's see, but we believe most of these trends are going to stay. I wanted to ask you though, Deepak, did you from an official perspective, do anything in order to support financial runway for your startups, for your entrepreneurs, for your VCs? We've seen a number of good models in Europe, in Israel, hugely interesting, where government intervention in the end facilitated much easier access to capital, extending runway for startups in this moment of crisis, with sometimes really intelligent models that don't put overly much taxpayer money on the table. Few examples, not all are perfect. We've seen some interesting measures. All those governments, when we spoke to them, being very clear, they've invested for the last decade into their ecosystems in terms of sweat and resource and taxpayers' money, and they're obviously scared of losing one or two generations and really falling back for a few years. Did you consider any measures? Have you put in place any interesting policy measures that we should share with our global community?
Absolutely. See, MSME and startups have been an absolute focus area of the government. In fact, that is the focus area, because startups fall within the MSME category anyway, to a large extent. And that has been, the government has been, all the policy announcements which you will see, and if you look at them closer in the past 90 days of our lockdown, have been focused on this sector primarily, to support them both on the demand side and the supply side. Let me make the easier one for you first. One is access to market, to get their entire inventories out and to get the supply chain going. Government will remain the biggest buyer now in economies, at least for the next 24, 36 months, because it's good in the eyes. And what we've done is we've given preferential access to our MSMEs and startups in all government purchases.
In all government procurement. That's a very sound policy measure, of course.
It is a very, very significant measure. And in many ways, in making it the terms easier for them, in getting them the credit faster, in getting special slices carved out only to be bought by them or procured by them. So that has been a big part. But more important than that has been that entire fiscal and monetary supply side for them. You know, starting from core capital to subordinate capital to debt and to, for example, delaying the debt payments or creating moratoriums for them, which have to be done. All that has been happened in a huge focused manner. But I'll tell you what is very interesting. I was just going through the statistics of June. Currently, my entire MSME startups are in a state of moratorium. They do not need to pay back their payments to the banks and all those installments. However, you know what was very interesting? MSME collections in June was 65%, even though there was a moratorium. And more interestingly, microfinance collections, you know, all this entire microfinance and fintech solutions which have been there, they started the month with 60%, they ended the month with 85%. This was a huge eye-opener for me, that even though you're in a moratorium and you do not need to, yet here is an entire segment which is saying, guys, I will pay my dues.
Which is healthy enough to serve their debt and their interest payments. That's
just to show a mindset of resilience.
Mm-hmm.
And more interestingly, how fast we moved out. My FMCG numbers now of June are now more or less year on year, they're the same as that of last year.
That's impressive. That's really impressive, because of you may have seen the numbers from Europe and North America. That's very different, and we are fearful of what that means for recession.
Our market focusing, because I'm the largest market and the fastest growing market. So some of these numbers, some of them have been really surprised me too. The ones I'm telling you about microfinance and MSMEs on the collections, they surprised me, frankly. Yeah. But yes, that gives me a lot of encouragement that one, all the elements which the government is putting in place are working. There is some parts to it. Will it ever be a utopian scenario? It cannot be. But yes, we're trying to get as close to paradise as we can. And I really have a feeling, and my belief is that this entire virus will make us healthier in a way that it will take away the entire fat which we had created with the easy forms of liquidity which we were facing for the entire thing.
Yeah. Deepak, thank you very much. That's an upbeat message, a very positive picture that you're showcasing, an encouraging picture. Maybe allow me one last question. There is quite an amount of talent as lots of our startup economies have shrunk quite a bit. There's quite a bit of highly sophisticated global talent looking for new opportunities in the market. What would you say if people are looking at India, startup talent, software engineers, growth hackers, the experts at growing companies? Is India a place to look at, to come to the Indian startup ecosystems?
It's a no-brainer. It's always been the place. I mean, the human capital which we have here is unmatched anywhere on the planet, both in terms of numbers, etc. Let me give you a quick one on that. 2026, I will be 1.5 billion of human capital on the planet. Okay, I'll be the largest. 1 billion of those will be under the age of 35. I'll have a workforce of 900 million. I give you about anywhere between 900,000 engineers a year and doctors, new ones. And with an average age of 29, I will be the youngest on the planet all the way up to 2070, 2080. Tell me where else will you get that human resource and a trained, skilled human resource? You know, it was very interesting. Look at biotechnology, a thing as small as that. 100,000 professionals working in biotechnology with 21,000 graduates every year only in biotechnology. Why I'm excited about this, I just heard of it yesterday myself in one of the webinars which my team was addressing. In something as niche and specific as that.
Incredible scale. Yeah, that's really, really fantastic to hear. Deepak, I'm conscious of your time, and this is a fantastic and illuminating conversation. If I briefly summarize, I'm hearing from India a very positive message. You've built a startup ecosystem, facilitated the build of a startup ecosystem prior to crisis. You've seen huge success. And what I take away is a very resilient environment during the crisis when it comes to finance, when it comes to preserving structures, people operating very frugally. Lots of opportunity because frugal innovation is relevant to great parts of the world, the lesser rich parts of the world, so an opportunity to expand these ideas into many more markets, even outside of India, the large Indian market. And possibly is the most important takeaway, and I'm really encouraged in hearing that from many markets, a more democratic access to education, to business opportunities as we go more digital. And it is not the cluster, the big city only that allows you as a young entrepreneur to build a business, conceive an idea, build a business, get finance, but all of a sudden we are in a situation where we equalize access to these opportunities. And when I understood you correctly, that's very much what you are seeing. I took away 500 out of the 700 ex-communities or councils in India already see this kind of activity. Which I take away as a really positive message. So thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you today in this interview, which we will share with our community globally, and wishing you all the best and much success for the development of this great and vibrant ecosystem in India.
Thank you very much. And listen, please be safe. My best wishes to you and your family. And hopefully we get out of this in a week and as quick as possible.
Thank you very much, Deepak.